Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series held on the third Thursday of each month here at the Museum of Nebraska History. And you can find out information on the schedule of this series plus our other activities on our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speakers, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding for the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Good afternoon. It's nice to see you here on this fine winter day. And today's talk is on Nebraska's own Terri Lee, the best dressed doll in the world. We are pleased to have with us Museum Curator Laura Mooney and Exhibit Services Coordinator Tina Koeppe, who will tell us about the history of the dolls and the Nebraska State Historical Society's collection. Laura and Tina.
Hi, thanks for coming to our lecture. We're going to talk about our Terri Lee doll collection and the exhibit which we currently have up at the Nebraska History Museum. The idea for this exhibit came to us in March 2011. A woman named Lindsay Duda contacted me and suggested that we do an exhibit about the history of Terri Lee dolls. Lindsay told me that she was the great-grandniece of Violet Gradwohl, the woman who started the Terri Lee Doll Company in Lincoln. Lindsay currently operates the Terri Lee Company out of Chicago right now, and they produce dolls from the same molds that they used in the 40s and 50s. Lindsay had a small collection of Terri Lee dolls that she offered to loan us for the exhibit, and we had a couple of dolls in our collection. So we started to plan a small exhibit, but then we were contacted by a doll collector named Marilyn Carney. And Marilyn had a very large collection of Terri Lee dolls. She had around 290 Terri Lee dolls that she displayed in her home. And she'd been collecting Terri Lee dolls for years and years and was looking for a new home for them. And she offered her collection to us, and we, of course, said yes, thank you. So we immediately began to plan for a much bigger exhibit and began to catalog the collection. So I guess the history of the Terri Lee Doll Company really starts with the woman who invented the doll. And her name was Maxine Runci. Maxine Runci was originally from Omaha, Nebraska, and she was an artist, and she was an incredibly talented artist. Her family didn't have enough money to really send her to the college that she wanted to go to. She wanted to go to the Chicago Art Institute, and her dad worked for the railroad and couldn't afford the tuition. So she was attending municipal college in Omaha and paying her way by working at a department store running a doll hospital. And this was in the 1930s. And she got this drawing published in the Omaha Bee News in 1936. And it was printed along with a short article that just talked about Maxine, about how she worked at a department store and how she wanted to go to the Chicago Art Institute, about how that was her dream. And a wealthy group of art patrons in Omaha saw this, and they were really touched by her story. And they decided that they were going to send her to the school she wanted to go to. So they started a foundation specifically for her and raised funds, and within a short amount of time, I think it was less than a month, they had come up with enough money to pay for 4 years tuition at the Chicago Art Institute. So Maxine went to school in Chicago, and she was a great student, and in fact she ended up getting a scholarship to pay for 3 years of college based on her own scholastic merit. And she excelled in sculpture and painting, and after she graduated, she moved to California, and she married an artist named Edward Runci. And Edward Runci is a famous artist in his own right, and what he's most well known for is pinup art. And he and Maxine supported themselves by doing artwork for calendars. They did commissions for portraits for wealthy people. And they were able to support themselves by being artists. And they had one daughter in 1944, and her name was Drianne. And this is a picture of Drianne. This is Maxine and Drianne. In 1946, Maxine was working as a sculptor for a mannequin company, and she would sculpt mannequin heads for really high-end mannequins for fancy department stores. And she did this, to help pay the bills and support her family, but she was always dreaming and always coming up with inventions and ideas. And one idea that she had was a small mannequin that children could dress and play with. And so she'd worked on this prototype for a while, and she came up with, a design that she thought would be marketable. And she decided to take it to the American International Toy Fair in New York City. And so she took the train from California to Omaha, and her plan was to drop Drianne off at Grandma and Grandpa's house and then make her way to New York City by herself. So she's in Omaha, and she is one evening sitting at her parents' kitchen table. She's inspired by her young daughter, and Drianne was probably about 19 months old at this time. And Maxine sculpted a little model of her daughter, and she had the little chubby cheeks and the pot belly and the sturdy legs, and she just loved what she had come up with. And she made a wig for this doll, and her mother made a sunsuit for it, and she painted it, and she decided, I'm going to take this doll to the toy fair as well. So she had two dolls she was going to take with her to New York City. And while she's in Omaha, her Aunt Violet comes to the house to visit. And Violet was her mother's stepsister. Violet Gradwohl, she lived in Lincoln, and she was a homemaker, and she had been really active with the Girl Scout organization as a leader in the 1940s. Violet's daughter, whose name was Harriet, had just gotten married and left the house. So Violet she had an empty nest. She was looking for some new projects, and just was excited about this invention of her niece's, and decided she wanted to go to the toy fair too. So they went to the toy fair. They were initially turned away because they weren't actually registered as a vendor, and they were disappointed, but a person kindly let them display the two dolls in her booth, and the Terri Lee doll got a lot of attention. People were really interested in her. She wasn't a baby doll. She was really unique looking. Some people thought that her face was funny looking, but they were encouraged enough that on the way back to Lincoln and Omaha on the train, Maxine and Violet decided that they were going to start their own company. They were going to start a cottage industry making these dolls. They decided to name the doll Terri Lee because it was catchy, and the name Drianne wasn't as easy to remember. And they decided that the dolls would all have brown eyes. While working in the Lincoln Doll Hospital during World War II, during a time of make, do, and mend, Violet Gradwohl had noticed that most of the dolls had blue eyes. And that really bothered her because her daughter had brown eyes, and she could never find a doll that looked like her daughter. So they start a cottage industry. Maxine went back to California, and she handled the creative aspects of the company. She made molds for production. She came back to Lincoln to help train face painters how to paint the faces. Violet starts the factory up in the kitchen of her house in the near South neighborhood, and they start hiring some people to help them. They hire women to make clothing from their homes. They work with a local hairdresser named Ben Meyer to have wigs designed, and they start producing dolls. And their big break came in mid-late 1946 when the Terri Lee doll appeared in the Montgomery Awards in 1946 Christmas catalog. And she's right here. She's got the blonde hair and the blue dress. And the doll was $11.95, and she was really popular. By the end of that year, they had orders for 8,000 dolls. And they were in no way prepared to produce and market and sell that many dolls, but they did it. They got bigger factory space, hired more workers, and it's just impressive to me that this started off in the idea for the doll in February of 1946, and by the end of that year, the doll empire had gotten started.
So let's take a look at some of the dolls here. The first dolls were made out of a material called composition, and composition is typically made out of wood pulp and sawdust and glue, and then it's molded and painted. But sawdust was in really short supply in the years after the war, and so Gradwohl's brother, Forrest Lee, shipped boxcar loads of corn cobs from Clarinda, Iowa, to be ground up as a substitute. As you can imagine, corn was problematic. The material easily absorbed moisture, causing paint to chip and crack. And you can see here on this doll, a lot of the paint is cracking, and you can see some of the composition material underneath. So you can identify these early composition dolls in several ways. First of all, it's likely that they're going to have some chipping and cracking, and you'll be able to see the composition material underneath. It looks a little bit like a particle board. Another way is by looking at the doll's left hand. Terri Lee dolls over the years were sold with daisies attached to their left wrist or hand, usually attached with a wire or ribbon. And these early composition dolls have a hole straight through the left hand. So if your doll has a hole, it's likely it's one of the early composition dolls.
When the success of the Terri Lee doll seemed assured, Violet came out with a boy doll, and he was known as Jerri, and he was called Terri Lee's adopted brother. And he had all kinds of outfits that could match Terri's. And there's something that happens in the company right about this time, right as the company was starting to become successful, and that's that Maxine and Violet had a falling out. Maxine found herself cut out of communication. She was no longer contacted for advice or consultation about the factory, and her name without notice was dropped from the letterhead. And Violet started taking credit for the invention of the doll. Maxine never got any of the profits from the company, and she was a young, free-spirited artist, and she hadn't thought to copyright her idea, and she did not think that her aunt would take advantage of her this way. But Violet was a woman ahead of her time. She was a businesswoman. She got things done, and it was a rift that continued to divide the family for decades. They never reconciled. So Violet was really interested with she was fascinated by the 1945 creation of the United Nations Charter, and began to create dolls from around the world. And she had dolls with all kinds of costumes. Here's one from Ireland. She had created African American dolls. There was Bonnie Lou and Benji, and she had a couple of Latin American dolls named Guadalupe and Calypso. She has an Eskimo doll named Nanook. These dolls are all made from the same molds as the Terri Lee doll. They're just painted different colors and have different wigs.
So since the durability of composition was problematic, Violet began experimenting with a relatively new product in the toy industry, plastic. So it was a really exciting time. She actually claimed that she destroyed her kitchen experimenting. And again, the company moved really quickly, and by the fall of 1947, Terri Lee dolls were being made of plastics. They were actually molded in Omaha by the Tip Top Products Company, and then they shipped the various parts of the dolls to Lincoln for assembly. They used a lot of different formulas of plastics, including ethyl cellulose, called Celcon, and Ethocell. These formulas were constantly changing, so one doll could be made of multiple kinds of plastics. In 1948, they began using another kind of plastic called Cellatone. These plastics came in a variety of colors, and so they painted the dolls from head to toe with flesh-colored paint. And I've noticed on some of the dolls in our collection that if you look at the edges of the body and the limbs, you can see different colors of plastics underneath. So it's pretty interesting from a manufacturing standpoint to look at the dolls and what was going on in the plastics industry. By 1948 or 1949, they started using a new plastic called Tenite 2, and you can see an example of a Tenite 2 doll there. Tenite 2 was an interesting material in that they could start tinting it to look like skin color. So they stopped painting the dolls from head to toe, and eventually they were just painting the faces, so you can see the eyes and the mouth on that doll and her cheeks, and sometimes they paint the knees as well. But they didn't have to paint the whole body. So we'd love to learn more about the plastics that the company was using, especially from anyone that worked at the factory, because it will really help us to understand the plastics that are used in the dolls and help us better preserve the collection as a whole. Lincoln era dolls have a patent pending Terri Lee mark on their back, right between the shoulders. And so this is one way you can determine whether or not your doll was made in Lincoln or later in California. The later dolls, they dropped the patent pending and it says only Terri Lee. Talk a little bit about face painting. The way that the dolls' faces are painted can be a clue as to when they were made. The early Lincoln dolls were said to have really symmetrical eyes and eyelashes and eyebrows. But the face painters, from what we understand, were given some freedom in the way that they painted the faces. So you can really see a lot of variation in the Lincoln era dolls. The shapes of the brows, how many eyelashes they have, the shapes of the pupils. And it's also interesting to note that these early Lincoln dolls seem to have a much more pouty looking mouth than some of the later dolls. This is a Tenite 2 doll that was made late in the Lincoln era. You can see her eyelashes are not symmetrical, but we've read that collectors have done some research and think that by around 1951, this was the standard way that most eyelashes were drawn. They had 5 on the left eye and 3 on the right upper eye.
So one thing that's unique about the Terri Lee Doll Company is that they had a very clever marketing campaign. And back in 1946, Violet Gradwohl knew that economic situation in the United States had improved. A lot of people who'd grown up during the Depression and the deprivations of World War II were eager to buy things for their children and to spoil their children in ways that they had not known themselves. So, but in order to promote these dolls to customers, the Terri Lee Company had to advertise, and they had advertisements, and this one's from Woman's Day magazine. They had a partnership with Peter Pan Peanut Butter that featured Terri Lee dolls. They had newsletters, catalogs advertising the clothing. They had a warranty on the dolls where each doll was packaged with a blank hospital admission certificate so that if your Terri Lee doll broke, you could send her back in and she would be repaired for free. And as a result of this, girls all around the United States in the late 40s and the 50s knew about the Terri Lee doll and wanted to own one for themselves. The doll owners were referred to by the company as Little Mothers, and they had contests for Little Mothers. And here's one contest winner named Carol Robertson, who won a trip to visit the Terri Lee doll factory. And in this little ad here, Carol talks about how Terri Lee is more than a doll. She's her best friend. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to be the case for a lot of little girls. This wasn't a baby doll. This was a doll that you could dress in clothing similar to those that you wore. You could take Terri Lee with you, and she could be a part of your life and do the same kinds of things that you did.
So let's talk a little bit more about the clothing. Personally, that's one of my favorite things about the Terri Lee doll. She has wonderful variety of outfits. Here's some of her wintertime clothing, which some of us could have used this morning since we're having such a snowy day. She had snowsuits, she had wonderful coats, rabbit fur jackets, and lots of rabbit fur accessories. The clothing was made in the factory in Lincoln, but also there were people that sewed out of their homes. So I've talked to a couple people that have done sewing, who did sewing through their homes, and they would pick up the fabric pieces that were already cut out, and then they would do the assembly and sewing at home. The clothing was really high quality. They had snaps and buttons, and they were made to withstand heavy play and removal and washing. And they're just fabulous, some of the prints to look at. So Terri had clothes for school days. Clothing came in a variety of colors. There were also hand-knit suits, and here you can see Terri and Jerri have coordinating outfits. That was common. There'd be outfits that little Jerri could wear as well that matched Terri's outfits. Clothing for pretty much any occasion that a little girl would have, Terri also had. So there were dance outfits and skating outfits, a wonderful collection of Western wear that includes these leopard printed chaps for Jerri that are pretty fun. You could also purchase a wardrobe for your Terri Lee clothing. The lower image there is the wardrobe that Marilyn Carney had in her collection, and is now part of the museum's collection, so you can see it out on exhibit. And the other image is a page from one of the Terri Lee fashion parades advertising the wide variety of clothing that you could purchase with your treasure chest wardrobe. The clothing was often tagged with the Terri Lee name, and collectors have done a lot of research on these tags and have indicated that the upper tag with kind of the loopy style T and L were used early in the Lincoln era till about 1950 or 1951. And then the lower printed tag was introduced, and that was used into the Apple Valley era. So if you have some clothing with those kinds of tags, that can be a good clue as to dating them.
Violet Gradwohl loved cowboy culture. She loved country music. She loved Western clothes. She loved horses. And she was a really big fan of the famous singing cowboy Gene Autry. And while on vacation in California, Violet was able to visit Gene Autry's studio and got to meet him, and decided she wanted to make a Gene Autry doll. And she worked with Gene Autry on a contract. He would receive a percentage of commissions for the dolls that were sold. And these dolls, they were made with the same molds as the other Terri Lee dolls. He had painted hair, and his eyes are decals. And he had an elaborate variety of Western clothes. And Gene Autry came to Lincoln for an appearance at Boys Town. He also did a performance at UNL, and he came to visit the Terri Lee doll factory, and he spent some time with Violet and her family. And a lot of the photos that were taken that day are really important, because we haven't seen anything like this that shows how the dolls were manufactured. And here you have a factory worker demonstrating how the molded plastic pieces are welded together using acetone. The Gene Autry doll was not a big seller, unfortunately. Violet believed that maybe children didn't want to play with a doll that looked like an adult, so she quit producing them, but she did continue to produce the Western clothing, and that was a big seller. That was incredibly popular and made a lot of money for them. Gene Autry was a pretty savvy businessman himself, and the commission, the royalty that he requested was pretty high, and Violet did feel like it cut into her profits, but she didn't want to lose Gene Autry as a friend, so she continued with the deal for quite a while. Another doll that was created by the Terri Lee Doll Company is the Patty Jo doll. And Patty Jo was the creation of a cartoonist named Jackie Ormes. Jackie Ormes is known as the first African-American female cartoonist in the United States. And from 1945 to 1956, Jackie published a cartoon strip called Patty, Jo, and Ginger, and it appeared in the Pittsburgh Courier. And this cartoon strip features two sisters. There's Patty Jo, and she's the sassy, politically savvy little girl, and then there's her glamorous big sister Ginger, who never gets to talk. And a lot of the messages in these cartoons are, I mean, they're very politically liberal. She's talking about equal rights for people of all colors. She's talking about war. So Jackie Ormes was way ahead of her time. And for a lot of young African Americans growing up and reading the Pittsburgh Courier, this cartoon strip had a big influence on them and the way that they looked at the world. So Jackie wanted to have a doll that was based off of her cartoon character. And she was going to try to create one herself, and she thought about doing a paper doll, and she was coming up with some clay prototypes of her own. And she was told about a doll factory in Lincoln, Nebraska that was already producing a black doll. And so she came to Lincoln and met with Violet Gradwohl, and the two women got along fabulously. And Violet decided that she was going to produce a Patty Jo doll. Jackie trained artists how to paint Patty Jo's face. She has the same body as the other Terri Lee dolls. She has different hair. Her hair is normally in pigtails, and she's got more of a dramatic, sort of sassy face. So this doll was manufactured according to very high standards. A lot of African American dolls prior to this time were based off of racial stereotypes, and Jackie Ormes had always thought that was offensive, and it really bothered her to see little African American girls playing with white baby dolls as if they were preparing for careers as maids and servants. So this was something that was really important to her, and Violet Gradwohl helped that dream come true. So the contract that Jackie and Violet signed together in 1947 specified that Jackie would receive 2.5% royalties on each Patty Jo doll sold wholesale. She also was allowed to market and sell the dolls herself through mail order. And so the dolls would be shipped to her. She lived in Chicago, and they would be shipped to her apartment, and she would paint the faces herself, and then she would sell them by mail order. And she paid for ads herself in Ebony magazine, and she had her home address there, and people could write her a letter and send money, and she would mail them a Patty Jo doll. So for unknown reasons, the dolls were discontinued after being created for a couple of years.
This next collection of dolls is called the Heart Fund series, and they're wearing dresses that were produced each year to raise funds for the American Heart Association to help combat rheumatic fever. So each year there was a new outfit or a new collection of outfits. This is an example from the 1952 fashion parade showing the Heart Fund outfit along with an Irish outfit, and an image of one of the dolls from Marilyn Carney's collection wearing that outfit. You could purchase a doll wearing the outfit, or you could just purchase the dress. So Marilyn Carney had a very nice collection of Heart Fund dresses. Before Terri Lee, Violet Gradwohl had done some work with the Girl Scouts locally in Lincoln, and by the fall of 1948, Terri Lee also had her own Girl Scout and Brownie uniforms. They were actually made from the same fabrics as regular girls' uniforms. They also added Campfire and Bluebird uniforms as well a few years later. And if you can see the description there from the Fashion Parade catalog, Terri Lee is again marketed as companion doll. So just like you, Terri can wear her uniform and accompany you to your Girl Scout or Bluebird meeting.
Violet was interested in using vinyl to create dolls. Vinyl was a pretty new product in the early 1950s, and she first tried making some of her Terri Lee dolls out of vinyl, and the vinyl created a lot of problems, and the big one was that it would become sticky over time. And we don't know a lot about the production of vinyl. In the early 1950s, it wasn't an exact science. So the dolls would, as the vinyl would degrade, it would get sticky, and then it would just become crumbly and fall apart. So Marilyn Carney has a vinyl doll that was part of her collection, and we do not know why, but this doll is in fine condition, and it's not sticky. It hasn't started to fall apart, so it's pretty rare, and we were overjoyed to get it. Another vinyl doll that the company began to produce was called Baby Linda, and she was a baby doll. She was designed by a famous sculptor named Brenda Putnam, and Brenda Putnam specialized in sculpting children, and she had invented a baby doll in 1950 that was anatomically correct, and so she'd gotten a lot of media attention, and she'd caused a lot of scandal with this doll. So of course Violet wanted to be friends with her and partner on a new exciting doll creation. The Baby Linda doll had a lot of problems from the beginning. The molds to create her, the fingers, you can see they're all separated and kind of splayed. They would fall off in the molding process. The vinyl skin would discolor. You couldn't get her wet because the metal parts inside would rust. And there was a legal issue. Her name had to be changed slightly to prevent a lawsuit. Critics said that the Linda baby looked like a frog because of her hands and her feet. So she unfortunately was not very popular, and customers would a lot of times sprinkle talcum powder on their vinyl dolls to combat the stickiness. A lot of the dolls didn't even make it out of the toy store showrooms. They would just get returned because of problems.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Terri's hair. These are some examples of the early wigs that Terri had. They were made out of a plastic Celanese fiber. It's very coarse, and it was typically used for mannequins at the time as well. It could be dyed in different colors though, so when you ordered a doll, you could specify the color of the wig that you wanted. In the early years, the wigs were made through Ben Myers, who was known as Ben Your Hairdresser, and he had several salons as well as a beauty school here in Lincoln. He designed the wigs and used beauticians from his shops and made some wigs on commission. Later on, we understand that wiggers worked through the Terri Lee factory as well as out of their own homes. The wiggers would roll Terri's curls on metal curlers that were made by the Tip Top company, but Tip Top also made some plastic curlers that were sold to doll owners for home use, and this is an example from Marilyn Carney's collection. Jerri's wig was a little bit different, although the first Jerri wigs were made out of that same coarse Celanese fiber. Pretty soon into the company's history, they started using these sheep's wool wigs. Some of them are kind of wavy, some of them are more tightly curled, and so both Benji and Jerri had these style of wigs. And we also understand that a few Terris were produced with a short wig made out of lamb's wool, and they were advertised as a poodle cut hairstyle. In around 1951, a new material became available. It was a much finer Celanese fiber, and Violet Gradwohl called it Raysheen. As you can see, it's very shiny, so the name fits. The platinum blonde there, that is basically an undyed version of this fiber, and then it can be dyed in all different colors as well. Another material that was used was Saran, and that was typically used for dolls with pigtails.
So Between 1946 and 1951, the Terri Lee doll factory moved from location to location, and they kept finding factory space that was a little bit bigger so that they could produce more dolls. And in 1951, the factory was located at 2012 O Street, and they shared the building with a couple of other businesses. They had the top floor of this building here, and on December 15th, 1951, around midnight during a snowstorm, the factory burned down. And a police officer doing his rounds heard a burglar alarm going off at the factory and went to check it out and discovered the place was on fire. And the place was, the chemicals and the materials they were using were incredibly flammable. And so once the building was on fire, the whole thing was just destroyed. And it had, after the fire, it had to be tore down. The biggest loss of the fire was considered to be about 150 dolls that were at the Terri Lee Doll Hospital, and little girls immediately began writing letters and asking if their dolls had survived, and it was just considered to be a huge loss due to the sentimental value of these children's toys. And Violet Gradwohl swore that she was going to get out of the doll business. She was briefly hospitalized for exposure that she suffered from being outside the night of the fire, and she had a nervous breakdown, and she started to get more letters from children telling her that they would wait as long as it took to buy more dolls and to get their orders filled. So she decided she was going to start the company up again, and she began to look for a new place to put her factory. And it was still, the country was still recovering from World War II, and it was reportedly hard to find space to start a new factory in Lincoln. And Violet decided that she was going to go to California and look for space. And she loved California. She loved the warm weather. She had always dreamed of having a ranch and raising thoroughbred horses. So she decided to move her company to a resort community called Apple Valley. And Apple Valley was the kind of place where you could ride your horse into town wearing your cowboy hat and your cowboy boots. And it was rustic but luxurious. There were a lot of Hollywood stars at the time that were spending time in Apple Valley. There were cowboy movies being filmed there, and she just loved it, and she wanted to live there. And so she bought a factory. She painted it pink. Locals called it the Pink Cake. There was an Air Force base nearby, and dependents of military men who were eager for employment, so she had no problem getting factory workers. And by March of 1952, she had a grand opening, and this is her, and this is in the office of her new factory building. And she began to create new doll clothing, new types of dolls, and the company continued to be very successful in those early years.
So this is the new maker's mark that was used after the company moved to Apple Valley, and as you can see, it just says Terri Lee. They dropped the patent pending. The dolls and clothing underwent quite a few changes after the company moved to California. They also began using a new lighter weight plastic about 1952. They continued to use the printed style Terri Lee tag on the clothing that we saw earlier, but around the mid-1950s, a new Terri Lee tag was introduced, and it's an embroidered tag that you can see there on the right. I thought you'd enjoy seeing a few examples of the Apple Valley era clothes. There's so many fun prints, monkey prints, bird prints, rabbit prints. The one on the left is actually a child wearing a barrel. They continued to produce the skating outfits, lots of Western wear, costumes like the image in the center is a masquerade costume. It came in different colors. We have also a purple and black version, or a pink and black version. There were also some new dolls that were introduced around that time. Tiny Terri and Tiny Jerri are our smaller doll. They have sleepy eyes. As you can see, the eyes are a little bit different. And another unique characteristic about them is that their head will turn when you move their legs. many of their outfits match the full-size Terri and Jerri Lee. So that's a fun thing for collectors, and I imagine for kids at the time would be to get outfits to match all 4 dolls. So you'd have full-size Terri and Jerri, and then your tiny Terri and Jerri matching. And actually, Violet had to take out a $230,000 federal Small Business Administration loan to build an addition to the factory to start producing those dolls. So that did create a huge debt for the company at the time. This is another doll, Connie Lynn, that was introduced. Connie was named for Violet's granddaughter, and like the tiny Terri and Jerri, she has the sleepy eyes as well. She's quite a large doll and rather heavy and awkward, I think, for kids to play with, so she wasn't very popular. And here you can see the real Terri Lee, which was the nickname of Violet's daughter, along with her daughters, Violet's granddaughters, Connie and Linda. And they're here in one of the Fashion Parade catalogs showing the dolls that bear their names.
So life was not all rosy in California. Violet had really hoped that things would continue to be successful. She started to spend a lot more time on her ranch, and she had some race horses that she would travel around down to Mexico to take to horse races. And she became kind of distracted, and she'd hired a bunch of managers and staff that she hoped would run the company for her, and it didn't really work out that way. One of her assistants, a woman named Catherine K. Fassel, actually worked for Violet for a little while in 1953 and then quit and stole some molds and some marketing materials and went to another manufacturer and began producing this doll called Mary Jane, who had some similarities to Terri Lee, but it was not as high quality. The Mary Jane doll has sleepy eyes, and she has a walking mechanism where if you move her arms, her legs move. And Violet had to sue in order to get this doll taken off the market, but it was determined that the only thing that violated her copyright was the head. And so before long, this doll appeared back on the market with a different head, and it bit into the Terri Lee Company's profits because a lot of young customers were confused by the dolls and bought this one instead, and she was a little bit less expensive, so she had some competition there. And the company started to really go into debt because of all these new dolls that they were producing, and the factory and like the equipment. And before too long, the company was about $1 million in debt, and Violet did not know what to do. So she hired a financial advisor named Marvin James Miller. And it is unknown whether Violet knew that Marvin had a criminal history that included embezzling. And he had owned a carpet factory in California that had burned down in a mysterious fire, and he'd received a very large insurance settlement from that fire. And she wrote Marvin James Miller a check for $1,000 on November 13th, 1958. And a couple days later, a fire at the Apple Valley factory completely destroyed everything. And the fire was pretty quickly determined to be an arson. They had a gas station attendant that remembered selling gasoline to a man who matched Marvin's description, and they found gasoline in his car. And Violet was looked at as having some knowledge of the arson, and she did not receive any insurance money, and her reputation was ruined. There was an auction. She had to sell off her ranch and what was left of her factory and what was left of her equipment in order to pay off some of her debts. And even then, this is a part of a brochure for the auction for her ranch, and just the auction, she did not get as much money as her property was worth, so it was a pretty big disappointment.
So Violet attempted to work with some other companies to continue producing the Terri Lee line. She briefly worked with Magna Enterprises, and then authorized the Marfan Company to use the molds to produce Terri Lee, Connie Lynn, and Tiny Terri dolls. Marfan introduced a new doll called Talking Terri, and she had a small speaker in her head and she could be plugged into a record player. The dolls were not very successful, however, and this may be because, for one thing, you couldn't wash their hair because of the electronic components in the head, so you couldn't style their hair the same way you could with the other Terri Lees. Children also forgot to unplug them occasionally and would tear the record players off a table. So the boxes actually came with a warning saying to remember to unplug your doll so you won't break your record player.
So disagreements between vendors and the absence of Violet's input effectively ended the production of Terri Lee dolls in 1962. Legal complications arose, and it took a 3-year court battle to get the doll molds back. Violet eventually moved to Virginia to be closer to her daughter Terri Lee, and she passed away in 1972 at the age of 71. So in the early 1980s, collectors started to take a renewed interest in Terri Lee, and they began to have to form collecting clubs and newsletters, and they had conferences around the country, and people became interested in the story of the Terri Lee Doll Company and wanted to know more about the dolls. And in 1991, collectors began having more conventions all around the country, and at one of the conferences in 1996, a doll manufacturer from California announced that he had acquired the original molds for the Terri Lee dolls and that he was going to start making a reproduction. And the surviving family members of Violet's were really upset by this, and they were not sure how he had acquired the molds, and they had to sue him to get the molds back and to copyright the Terri Lee Doll Company name. And to celebrate their success, they reformed the Terri Lee Associates LLC, and they had a 50th anniversary doll produced by Knickerbocker Toy Company. And the dolls, the corporate office is located in Chicago, and it's ran by Lindsay Duda, who is a great grandniece of Violet's. So they're still around.
So in conclusion, we thought we'd tell you a little bit about our process of cataloging and doing the exhibit and storing the dolls. Collection staff have started cataloging the collection, and we're photographing each doll, describing them in detail, assigning numbers for tracking purposes, and then all of this information is going into a database, and we're exporting it to our website so you can search for Terri Lee dolls and learn more about them there. As you can see, we have multiple views showing the different layers of clothing, including the undergarments. We're also carefully recording the condition of each doll so we can monitor for changes over time. As you can imagine, storing the dolls will have some challenges because of the plastics and composition materials that have some issues with being fragile and deteriorating over time. This is another unique early doll that was actually donated by Kathleen Packard, early African-American Terri Lee doll. She's made of composition and has quite a few cracks. And this is a storage box and mount that Laura Moore in our exhibits department made for this doll. Next, we'll be sending the dolls in batches to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Ford Conservation Center in Omaha, and they'll be looking at each doll in detail, examining their condition and determining if any treatment is needed at this point, and they'll also be developing some storage mounts and boxes for the dolls. The Carney collection in reality is in very good condition right now. It was very well taken care of, but plastic, it does deteriorate over time, and so I thought I'd show you a few examples of some of the deterioration we've seen on a few dolls. As you can see, there's kind of a white powdery residue that appears on some of the plastics. So if possible, we're removing clothes for storage just so things don't get stained if a doll starts to get some of this powdery residue. We'll also try to keep them cool and limit handling as much as possible and monitor the condition over time.
So there are some things we did to exhibit these dolls to help protect them, and because of the way that plastic degrades, it off-gasses. And if you've ever smelled old plastic toys, you may notice that they have kind of an odd chemical odor. Well, that's the plastic decomposing. And when you put toys like that inside of an airless vitrine, they're going to start decomposing even quicker. And so we drilled holes in the tops of the vitrines that we display the dolls in, so that there's a little bit more airflow. We also have hidden in all of the cases little tins of activated carbon, and that will absorb some of the off-gassing and help keep that under control. We also printed anything that goes inside the display cases is mounted on microchamber board, which will absorb some more of the pollutants inside the cases. Another thing that's really bad for old plastic is heat and bright light, and so we monitored the light levels very carefully in here. We had to turn off the lights in our display cases because they were really hot and really bright. So we hope to keep these dolls around for decades and decades into the future. So we're trying to take care of them as best as we can. So we thank you for coming to listen to our brown bag lecture. The Terri Lee doll exhibit will be up at the Nebraska History Museum until September 1st, 2013. And we have a few minutes to answer any questions if you would like to ask any. Yes?
Did the gentleman who burned the factory down, did he do time? Was he convicted of that?
He was convicted of arson and spent some time in prison. And I don't know, I tried to figure out what happened to him, and he just disappeared after that.
Was Violet ever, like, did she have charges brought against her, or she just didn't get her money?
No, Violet never had charges brought against her, but she just received no insurance money for the loss of the factory. Yes?
Do you have any idea how many dolls are still around? Or how many were produced, even?
I don't have a guess at the total number produced. Marilyn Carney had about 288 in her collection, and we know of some other collectors out there that similarly have very large collections, but we're not aware of another museum that has a collection as large as ours now, so we're really pleased at that, and we hope that lots of people will come see it and use it as a study collection even, so.
Yes?
You mentioned the doll hospital. Can you talk about what kids sent their dolls back if they broke an arm or something? Or what did they do?
At the Terri Lee Doll Hospital, dolls could receive new wigs, they could be repaired. The Terri Lee dolls the way that they're constructed is there's a rubber band that connects the head and the arms and the legs together, and those break periodically. And so you could send your doll in to have her restrung, you could have her face repainted, you could even have the color of her wig changed if you wanted to. So they did all different kinds of things, and it turned out to be a pretty good policy for them, a pretty good warranty. Yes?
Can you still buy a Terri Lee doll?
Yes, you can still buy Terri Lee dolls. The Terri Lee Doll Company produces a few models of Terri Lee, and we have them for sale in our Landmark store. You can also buy them from the Terri Lee website and in selected high-end department stores.
What did they originally cost?
The dolls originally cost $11.95. And if you'd like to learn more about the history of the Terri Lee Company, there's an article in the latest issue of Nebraska History magazine that goes more into detail than the exhibit does. And there's so much to this story that it would make a great movie. But there's a limit to how much we could fit into our gallery and on the wall. So check out the article. Yes?
Do you think all the California ones had that Terri Lee stamped in the back of them?
As far as I know, from what I've read and from what research I've seen from the collectors, they all had that Terri Lee stamped in the back.
I have one from California, and doesn't have that. So, but I know it came from California, it wasn't made here.
All right, well, thank you for coming to our lecture.